Good evening. It's great to be with you again on this nice Sunday evening. A little cool here. Don't worry if you're in our area. I'm pretty sure it's supposed to warm up the next couple days and then get cold again on Wednesday. Sorry, nothing I can do about it, but that's the way it is. But it's great to be able to be together as we're continuing our time here, and I just want to be more hip with it. That's why I'm calling this one Unlocking Daniel. And one of our members is looking for a Bible for our guest. No, go into number 42, and it'll be the same one that I have. And it's large print. It's my backup. Number 42 mailbox. There you go. All right. And that's one of the things. If you do come and you just happen to be traveling through and you're like, well, I don't have a Bible, come on in. We have those that you can use. In fact, if you don't have a Bible at all, we have those that we give away. That's kind of the way it goes. And if I start to get low, we just go and pick up more. It's usually what we do. We get them from the used bookstores. We start looking around and we get them out. But it's always great to be together. So as I said, just being more hip, we're calling it Unlocking Daniel. Catchy title, that kind of thing. It's not really, I'm not going to tell you anything that's not, I'm going to say, well-known in scholarship. I'll tell you this much. If you ever, and you're studying the Bible, and you think you've come up with something brand new, or you hear somebody say, you got a brand new teaching, I'm going to guarantee you you're going to have one of two problems. First, it's probably not brand new. Somebody's thought of it before. Two, if it is brand new, then odds are it's probably not something you should be, you're probably on the wrong track. And you might want to start at the beginning again. So there's usually a reason that it's brand new and no one ever thought of it before. So although I'm calling it Unlocking Daniel, this isn't anything that you're not going to be able to find some results. I'm gathering from a bunch of studies and things like that in particular. So with that, we're going to be continuing in Daniel tonight, and we're probably going to cover a larger section of text tonight. I dug through my notes back when I did a Bible study a while back called Living a Godly Life in an Ungodly Culture, which was a look at Daniel chapter 1 through 6. And when I looked at that, I did one chapter a week. It was a 6-week study and just kind of did it. So this is similar in that aspect because not a whole lot has changed in the text. But it means that in certain spots I'm going to cover a lot. Like the first week we only covered like 2 verses. And then the next night I went right back to verse 2 again. But this time we're probably going to cover a lot. We're going to finish off chapter 1 and we're going to go into a good section of chapter 2. So that's where we're probably going to be heading at tonight. But before we do, let's just open with a word of prayer. Oh, Father God, I just thank you to be able to be together, to have your word so readily available to us. And Father, I think sometimes we forget how much of a blessing it is to have your word at our fingertips, pretty much wherever we are. That we can have it in book form, we can have it in electronic form, we can have it in audio form. And Father, it's all available to us. And I pray that we will develop a continuing hunger for your word. For your word is truth, and your word directs us to life, which is found in you. And Father, tonight as we study Daniel, I pray that we will continue to learn together, that you would grant us understanding, and that, Father, even in the end, as we look at all this, that we'd realize this is for your glory, that you are revealed through your word, and that we could continue to be equipped to do the work you've called us, so that more people would learn of you. And so, Father, receive our study tonight, and I pray that you are glorified in it all, and that in all things our words will be true to you, and we thank you. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, as I said, we're looking at Unlocking Daniel. Now, if you've been with us, there's one theme in Daniel, and I'm going to say this every night, that I said it is the most important piece in Daniel that unlocks all of it in Daniel, and it hasn't changed in that. And the most important item through it all, and I'm giving a different reference than I had the previous before. Normally it was Daniel 1 chapter 2, Daniel chapter 1 verse 2. Let me get my words right here. Where it talks about, and God handed him over. Here in Daniel 1:17, you're wondering, okay, what would that be? Daniel 1:17, as for these 4 young men, God gave them. In other words, Who's equipped them? Who's giving them the ability? God is. Why? Because of God's sovereignty. If you even wanted a little bit before that, I could have used another one where it says that God gave them favor. Now, verse 9, I think it was. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. Who did it? God did it. So, and it's, as I said, throughout all of this, and you look at Daniel, it's God is sovereign. And you're going to unpack that all throughout Daniel. Because the very next thing, and we're going to start hitting on it, we probably won't really look into this, we'll almost get to it, but it's Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And Daniel even opens up, "Oh, king, live forever. God has revealed to you what he's going to do." God's the one who's revealed it to you. Then you run in with the fiery furnace. Their response is, we're going to trust in God's sovereignty. God can deliver us from this. He's over this all. Then when you get Nebuchadnezzar's arrogance, and Nebuchadnezzar, he was warned about it, but he gets up on his palace, looks around, and he says, "Look at all that I have made. Look at how splendid everything is." And then God reminds him who really is sovereign over it. That it was God who rose him up for this purpose. And therefore he caused Nebuchadnezzar to suffer from a type of mental illness which makes him act like a beast. And so he did. And then when the time was right, the end of it, and even Nebuchadnezzar's response is, as soon as his mind came to him, what did he do? He gave praise to God who is sovereign over it all. And then as you continue on and you look at everything, so the next one, his grandson writing on the wall. Who gave it? God was telling him that God was the judge. God was sovereign. He's the one who raised up the Medo and the Persians. Then even later on, you've got, this isn't in Daniel, but you get the start of it, King Cyrus comes into power. But that was prophesied before, during the time of Jeremiah. God was sovereign. Then when you start to look at all the events of the apocalyptic aspect of this book, chapter 7 through 12, it's all about God directing it. God is sovereign over it all. And the reason I want to drive that home is because as we continue to live in uncertain times, people suffer from anxiety, people suffer from worry. And when I teach on anxiety itself isn't really a mental condition. It's a faith condition. And what I mean, because there are what you classify as mental illnesses, but anxiety really isn't one. Despite the fact that people want to treat anxiety through medication, but all that really does is treat the symptom. It doesn't treat the issue. So when somebody, I admit I've watched every season of Canada's Worst Driver. I enjoy Canada's Worst Driver because you learn as much as anything. But in one season, one of the more famous characters of Canada's Worst Driver, she was on the 2 seasons. Her name is Angelina. And on her final drive, she made it all the way to the final. I think she was Canada's Worst Driver season 5, I think. I think she actually won the title. And by won the title, that's not a good thing. That means you're the worst. But she stopped and she's so anxious of this. And what'd she do? She took a Xanax. It was like, we're going to sit and we're going to wait until the Xanax takes effect. Does it actually fix anxiety? No. All it does is it can relax you for a little while. So so when I talk about anxiety for the most part, you feel anxious when you feel out of control. That's really what it is. And when we feel out of control, that means either we have no faith in ourselves to handle something, we've got no faith in the person who's supposed to be the expert in this, or you have no faith in the one who is sovereign over all things. And when a Christian suffers from anxiety, whether we like it or not, it really is a faith issue, not necessarily a mental issue. We have the wrong perspective. And so the sovereignty of God is an important aspect, because when we trust and we say, no matter what's going on, yes, this will happen, this could happen, but I am going to trust in the sovereignty of God, that He knows what He's doing. That He is going to, and this is our theme for February as well, He's going to use it for His glory and for our good, for the ultimate good. And we trust in that, and we have faith in that. And so even as you see Daniel and the others put in this situation, the constant stress there is sovereignty. That God is the one who's in charge of this. Yes, they're now under the control of King Nebuchadnezzar, but why are they there? Because God is the one who's sovereign over it. And then what do you see even in this? Although he's under this reign of Nebuchadnezzar, who's in charge of Nebuchadnezzar? God's in charge of Nebuchadnezzar. God is sovereign. And so when we even look, as I said, even now, we're living in such an uncertain time. We're like, what's going to happen with these tariffs and what's going to happen? Well, it's like, well, you look at it and you go like, well, Donald Trump is kind of out of it. Megalomaniac, I guess is probably a good word in this. And he's like, he's going to do this with no consideration for anything else. Do we worry about this? Well, we don't have to. Because even as, quote unquote here, as powerful as Donald Trump would be as the commander-in-chief of the United States, God is sovereign over him. In other words, no matter what takes place, it may get rough, it may get difficult. Don't think it wasn't rough and difficult in Babylon for Daniel. We can rely on the fact that God is sovereign. And that is where our faith goes in. And so, as I said, in every week, I'm going to drill that home until we are sick of it, until it's so part of us that God is sovereign over everything, that we don't have to worry about anything anymore. We just go about the work that He has put before us, the work of our hands, and we give praise to Him. And that's what we do. And so, in this, we were picking up, and I think I'll do some reading tonight. I didn't do as much reading last week with us. And so last week we kind of left off, and we were dealing with how to handle the issues of not compromising into the culture. And if you remember that, it was about knowing where our line in the sand is, purposing in our heart, and how to handle when these situations come up the same way kind of Daniel did. But I'm going to pick up Daniel 1 verse 15. That's where I'll start reading for a little bit. That sounds good. So this is after Daniel's brought forth. He's purposing in his heart. He's not going to eat the king's food because it's been offered to the chief god of the Babylonians. And Daniel knows from his original studies that he's not to do this. He's not to eat their sacrifices. So he's proposed that, hey, give us fruit and vegetables and water for the next while. And when I say the next while, we're talking, Daniel knows that it's going to be 3 years of this. So it's not just a temporary thing for a while. But he said, the head of the eunuchs is like, wait a minute, this is going to be dangerous because if you're sick, you look sickly, I'm going to get in trouble for this for not doing my job. So Daniel proposes 10 days. Let's test it at 10 days. So we're going to pick that up in verse 15. And at the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine, and they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. As these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in the realm. Thus Daniel continued until the 1st year of King Cyrus. I'm going to stop there just for now, and we'll come back to chapter 2 later. Now, you got to remember, they're in this system. And I think this is one of the things that we need to understand of what's going on. They're in this system, and they're put in a school, is what they are. And don't forget that originally when they were brought in, they were to learn the customs, they would learn the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. That's what they were to learn. That's verse 4 of chapter 1. And so they're put in this. And so they're going to be learning in the literature, they're going to be learning things that I'm going to say if they had good parents back in Jerusalem, they would not be exposed to, if you know what I mean. You want to keep them out of this. You don't want to expose them to these things, not because you're afraid of them, but rather because you want them to hold to the truth. And yet they're put into this, and it seems that if you look at it, at the end it says that they are the brightest, the wisest, they can solve things better than the others. It seems that they did their studies well. So they spent their time learning. I think they also, like I said, they probably had an extra little bit of drive there too, given the fact they've already stepped out on faith and said, don't give us that food, and we're going to try to put in with this. But I think it's the importance here that I wanted to bring in, that they studied all of it. In verse 17, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, which means it had to do with the teachings of the Babylonians. Now, one of the things that you can run into that I look at, and I read a lot of articles from different perspectives, I like to see how people perceive things. And some of it's really interesting. Like, for example, this one has nothing to do with this, but they were complaining about the rise in the price of eggs under Donald Trump, and they were showing places that a dozen eggs was like $12, a dozen eggs $7, and they were comparing it to the price of Canada at the time. Now, you go, okay, that's kind of strange, but for the most part in Canada, a dozen eggs is what, $5, $6, something like that? Sorry, I buy it by the flat, so I pay like $10. But for a dozen. But it was interesting because at first they're putting forth this argument that look how bad it is. And then people in the comments, and this particular, they're not Donald Trump supporters in these comments. They're like, I think they've got a problem here. They're definitely be biased because I'm pretty sure I just bought eggs last week for like $3.50. And I went, it's like, what? And it became quite clear. What did they do? They picked and chose places where, be it for supply reasons or whatnot, that the price went up. I guarantee you right now, if you tried to go to Costco or something, this is before tariffs, and you tried to buy, particularly in like Alberta, BC, Manitoba, you tried to buy their organic eggs, that they're going to be quite expensive. And the reason being is because of supply. The supplier that supplies them, not just them, but a few other places of organic eggs, they ended up with a pretty bad case of salmonella being found in their eggs. So the supply went down, the price went up. And so the problem is when that happens and people only read, $12 for a dozen, like, what's their automatic response going to be? Look how bad it is. And so what can happen here, and the ultimate point is, we tend to try to keep our children as best we can away from certain schools of learning. Now, as we grow as Christians, I don't want us to be afraid of those schools. Now, I'm not talking about diving in head first and reading absolutely everything. But it's a matter of making sure you understand things. One of the things that you run into is people who, they represent Christianity, who will make this argument that dinosaurs never existed. And they'll say dinosaurs is like, then what about the fossils? The fossils and bones were put there by demons to deceive Christians. I'd really like to have a talk with them about this. But you can actually see that, and that perforates even to movies. I think the movie The Nun, I think. It's from the Conjuring series, the Conjuring horror series. It starts with a Catholic school kind of teaching, and the teacher teaching, and somebody asks about dinosaurs, and they have the nun basically say, dinosaurs never existed. What are they doing? Even in that kind of movie, they're perpetrating that Christians are anti-science. That's really what it is, although this is an odd way to kind of do it. But there really are people who say, well, dinosaurs didn't exist. Where'd they get that idea? Well, from people who want to say one thing or another. And they haven't been exposed to the other side of the teaching. Now, it's important, I think, as we grow up to be well-rounded, to learn both sides of arguments. And one of the things that is drastically lost in our culture today is critical thinking. It really is. Because of the way that society is, because of the rise of such a stark division in our media, you can get into a section and never hear the other explanation, kind of thing. So in other words, if all you're ever hearing is that this is evil, this is evil, this is evil, this is evil, then you're going to grow up thinking this is evil. If all you ever hear is they're crazy, they're crazy, they're crazy, then all you're going to think is they're crazy. And in fact, when I fielded a question a couple of weeks ago in youth group, a question about dinosaurs. And he's like, well, what happened to the dinosaurs? And I said, well, it's going to depend on what school you fall to. I said, in actuality, I'll tell you that in the studies they'll say they really don't know. I said, as much as you hear about this idea that a meteor came and struck it, well, they're not even sure where it hit, how it happened, where it caused it, that kind of thing. I said, so ultimately you're going to run into, I don't know. So and then you got other responses where what happened to them, what happened to the dinosaurs? Well, most likely they died out. Well, how would they die out? Well, if you take a look, if the climate suddenly changed due to one thing or another and they couldn't adapt, then they would most likely die out. Particularly if there was suddenly a very cold development that they couldn't survive. You got to remember, lizards are very different than mammals. Not just in the way they look and the hair and all that, but the warm-blooded, cold-blooded thing. In fact, if you think about it, in the first thing in the morning, I remember this one day, in one of our houses, we had a deck, and the deck was in place by cement cylinders, but they came out of the ground. And one day, my wife, she was out putting laundry out. She accidentally dropped a piece of laundry. She came down, and suddenly she came running towards me. I was like, what's going on? She's like, go deal with it right now. I'm like, deal with what? She's like, go pick up that shirt and you'll see. Sure enough, what had happened in the heat of the morning, a snake, fair size, crawled up on the cement block and wrapped itself kind of around the pole. What was it doing? Getting heat. I hated it in the garden. I put fabric down in the garden to stop weeds. I'd be picking up the weeds there, and all of a sudden I'd notice that the fabric over there would start moving. Like, okay, snake went under there. So if a sudden change happens, it's like you can get different explanations for these things. And he asked, well, why do they say this? And here's the point. I said, the reason being is because they're starting with a certain philosophy. They're starting with an already understanding, and then anything that fits it, they agree to it. Anything that doesn't, they throw out. I remember having a discussion a couple of years ago with the youth, and they said, why do so many people believe in evolution? And I said, I'll show you. And I brought them forth. I think I did this. You can find a video of this with another gentleman here I did on Sunday night. I brought him forth. I said, okay, what's something you're really good at? Something you're good at cooking. And he said, I'm good at cooking eggs. I said, great. We're going to have a debate, and everybody here is going to decide. He said, okay. I said, I'm going to go first. I'm going to argue that you're absolutely terrible at cooking eggs. He's like, okay. And then you're going to argue that you're good at it. I said, okay, sounds fine. So for the next 3 minutes, I just put forth an argument why he was terrible at cooking eggs. I said, okay. I said, that finishes my argument. I said, now go sit down. He went, what? It's like, go sit down. I said, go sit down. He was really confused. So we sat down. I said, okay. I said, now, based on the arguments that you hear, were they good at cooking eggs or not? And someone goes, based on the arguments? No. I said, that's the problem. You're only hearing one side. And as much as we want to say, oh, they're doing that side, I think Christians can run into that too. Where we just go, you know what, I'm going to state this. I don't understand. I'm going to stick to this, and I'm not going to learn the other side. I'm not going to understand these things. And so when you hear it, typically it's religion versus science. We forget that true science really just helps us understand the wonders of creation that God has made. And there's no reason to fear it. And so when Daniel's working in this thing, he's learning the customs of the Babylonians. He's learning the skills. And I'm going to guess he didn't just learn those in the long run, given the fact that it makes it clear that he served until the time of Cyrus. It means he also would have learned probably the Medes and the Persians. He learned as he went. And so we can't be afraid of this, especially with all the things that are out there. To understand what is coming. And one, it points out the dangers. It helps us to understand where people are coming from. And I'll admit, sometimes their arguments make absolutely no sense. It's fascinating to watch debates on the issue of abortion. And saying, it's like, the person come forth, and you can tell that they're only schooled in pro-abortion rhetoric. And why? Because they're talking, it's like, oh, it's just a clump of cells. And the person looks like, what do you mean by a clump of cells? It's like, that's all they are. It's like, you're a clump of cells. I'm a clump of cells. What do you mean by clump of cells? And they really had no answer for it, because you can tell they really hadn't thought it through. Because all they're getting exposed to. And this is why, even, again, I'm going to use the U.S. election here a little bit. When it came in, it's like Donald Trump is stripping away all women's rights. And all someone went, just a second. No, I can still vote. No, I can still work. No, it's like, what rights are you talking about? He's stripping all our rights. And again, the point is just, it's all rhetoric. But you have to be familiar with it. And don't be afraid of it. And I can tell you that any argument that you can run into from the atheist side that has to do with the scriptures or with the existence of God and Jesus, it is satisfactorily answered. Their arguments haven't changed in years and decades. They just repeat the same thing. And to know it. And don't be afraid of it. And so when you see this, and it's ultimately it's to trust in God for it. Because they're all out there. Now that doesn't mean you neglect the scriptures. Spend more time in the scriptures than anything else. Or else you could easily fall into it. Now, I'm not saying that you go into everything. Truthfully, that's not, I'll say, the job of the average Christian. That's more the job of the teacher, to know everything. But don't be afraid of it. And I found it fascinating years ago when the youth, they would ask lots of questions, and a lot of them were science questions. I get the question, like, what is dark matter? And ultimately, when I said dark matter doesn't exist, they went, wait, what do you mean dark matter doesn't exist? I said there's absolutely no evidence for dark matter. The only thing reason they say dark matter is because they look at this and they say this and then they say this and they say, okay, what can explain all this? And then what did they come up with? Dark matter. Why? Because they needed to, and I can tell you why, how it kind of works. This is a little bit of science for you. When particles slam together, and they do this in Hadron Collider and that kind of thing, two things form, matter and antimatter. When matter and antimatter touch each other after it's been formed, it poofs out of existence. It ceases to exist. Now you go, okay, how does that work? Just think of it in the math equation. +1, -1. When +1 is added to -1, it equals 0. Doesn't exist. So when they do these experiments and they slam in particles together, what they have to do very, very quickly is separate the two. And they use gravity to do it, basically. So here's the thing. If the Big Bang is true and an explosion happened, what should have we seen? Matter and antimatter exist at the same point. It always forms at the same amount. So what should have happened? We should have poofed. Nothing should have happened, basically. Happens, gone, we're gone. But it does. So therefore, something must have pulled the antimatter away, or pulled the matter away, take your pick. And therefore, some strong gravitational pull does this, so what's the most likely answer? Well, dark matter. Now, this is a simplification of it. But basically, it's kind of that idea. But see what they've done? They created something. But I know that because a kid asked the question, okay, let me study all this. Now, it's fascinating. I do understand the basics of most science. That's the kind of thing. I also understand most philosophy. But it's to understand, to not be afraid of it, to study, to understand what actually is going on in our culture. Why? Because if our mission is to go forth and make disciples, we have to understand who we're reaching. Let me put it another way. Paul says, to the Jew I became like a Jew, to the Greek I became like a Greek. That did not mean that he suddenly did everything Greeks do. It means he started to think the way they did, understand their arguments, engage himself in their life. But it did not mean that he turned against Christ and that kind of thing. So the first thing that we see is that they studied it all, but that's not all that comes with it, is when they developed this. And God is the one, remember again, God is sovereign over this, right? God, it even makes the point, and Daniel makes sure he puts in, God gave them knowledge and skill. And then what did they do with it? They did not say, okay, I'm going to take this and I'll serve the king and I'm going to look after myself. No, they actually used their ability for the best of all. And this is where chapter 2 kind of comes in. I'm going to touch in here. In chapter 2, it records Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Okay, Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. And then, I'm going to read chapter 2, verse 1 here. Let's pick up a bit of reading here. Now, in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Then the king gave the command to all the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dream. So they came and stood before the king. And the king said, I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. O king, live forever. Tell your servant the dream, and we will give the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, My decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap. However, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation. And they answered again and said, Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know for certain that you would gain time, because you see that my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time has changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, There is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such a thing of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with the flesh. For this reason the king was angry and very furious, and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men. And they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. So here you got the situation. Now there's another point here I want to look later. But here I'm focusing just on Daniel here. The king has given them such a command that they admit is impossible. The king's given this impossible. He's like, not only do I want you to tell me the dream, or interpret it, I want you to tell it to me. This past year at VBS, I did that same thing to the kids. I gave them all a piece of paper, gave them a pen, and I told them, okay, I had a dream. You tell me what the dream is, and then tell me what it means. And I'll tell you this, none of them were even close. That was the point. I said, it's impossible. You can't do it. And then he gets so mad that he's like, okay, go execute all of them, kind of thing. That includes Daniel and the friends who have entered into service. Now, if I'm going to jump here instead of reading all of this. Daniel is given the interpretation by God, but pick up at verse 24 of chapter 2. Therefore, Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went to them and said thus to him, Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Think about that. Daniel could have eliminated his competition. He could have said, King, they're trying to lie to you. You might want to execute them. That shows you're untrustworthy. We'll give you the interpretation. Daniel used the gift that God gave him, not just for himself, but he used it for the benefit of others, of everybody. And why? Because Daniel understood this point that it was God in heaven who made known the dream. And he gives praise to God. Now you go to the New Testament aspect of this, and you look at 1 Corinthians 12 and Romans chapter 12. They both have it. And they both make this point that each one has been gifted in accordance to the Spirit, as the Spirit wishes, for the benefit of all. So Daniel, even here, he's in a foreign culture where he's got his small clique here, but he's still using it in service of everybody. And that's one of the things that I think we have to understand, because when we live in our culture again is all about me. Look after yourself. Look after number one. Only look after number one. And as I said, Daniel could have done that. And I find it fascinating that he just said, don't kill anymore. It's like, let's save all of them. And keep in mind, you go future into this, under King Darius, the wise men who were there, they wanted rid of Daniel. So, why? Because it's we'll say, what is it, dog-eat-dog world kind of thing. You want to get to the top. You get to the top, you get the most benefits. Anybody who's in the way, you want to tear down. But Daniel was not just looking out for himself. Because ultimately, and here's the thing about that you can understand about God from the very beginning. One of the most fascinating events is in the book of Joshua. Not the Battle of Jericho. What happens just before it? Joshua sends his spies, finds out about the city, it's all locked up. They come back, report to Joshua. Then what's Joshua do? He goes out for a walk. He goes and seeks out God. Seeks out wisdom. And then what does he look? And he looks and he says he beholds a man who looks like he's dressed for battle. And you can imagine as Joshua is walking towards him, I imagine Joshua has his hand on his sword. And then he asks a question. Are you for us? Or are you for our enemies? And it's the reply that's most fascinating. His answer is, neither. And yet, what is he going to get Joshua to do? Judge Jericho. But he's like, I'm not against them. I'm not their enemy. It's judgment, yes. But it's not because he's saying, I hate them. It's not because I detest them. It's because it's necessary due to sin. And so even in Babylon, what does Daniel understand? God's not against these people. In fact, if God was against them, then they would have been judged. They wouldn't have been victorious. And when we look at our culture today, we got to understand, yes, there are people out there committing abominations in the sight of God. Not only are they committing abominations in the sight of God, they're encouraging those and celebrating those to do so as well. And they're praising it. And yet, at the same time, God is not against them. The judgment's going to come. And so the attitude needs to be the same for the Christian. That we're not against them. We want to instruct them in the things of God. We want to teach them of the one who came and died for them. We want them to understand that, yes, they're in bondage to sin that ultimately lead to destruction. But we're not the ones who's going to bring about that destruction. We're not the ones to act as the judge. We proclaim God's judgment. There's nothing wrong with that. That is the way it is. Although Jonah, his ultimate goal was wrong, he did what was right, which was proclaim the city's going to be destroyed in 40 years. But even he understood what God's purpose behind that was. Because when God said that this was about, Daniel's like, didn't I know that you were a merciful God? It's like, this is why I didn't want to come. Because I knew you would show mercy. Now, Jonah's wrong in that. But we can't view people as like, oh, just let them. No. Daniel is using the gifts he's gotten to even serve in the secular culture, ultimately, to bring glory to God. And what happens in the end? Nebuchadnezzar does. In fact, we'll get to it. Nebuchadnezzar is one of the authors of the Scriptures. He's one of the ones that God used. And you got to think that Daniel was there the whole time. And then under Darius and Cyrus, what does Darius make a decree after the governor Darius after the decree? It's like nobody can say anything against his God. And then you have Cyrus, who would get reports from his governors, and Cyrus also gives praise to God. He's God's agent. And so you use it in the service of God. Now we're going to hit something that's kind of interesting here. This is going to be a complete shift at the same time. You go, why would that be? This is an issue of language. Now you probably just went right by it, because I read this section. You probably went right by it and didn't even think anything of it. But it's something more going on here. So, find the spot here. Verse 4. That's where I'm going to pick up. But before this, so the king gave the command, and it lists the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans. It says, then the Chaldeans, verse 4, spoke to the king. Now the Chaldeans there just means, they're just the spokesman for the rest of the group here. But they spoke to the king in Aramaic. Now, here's the thing, because punctuation doesn't really exist in the Hebrew text. They may not have spoken to the king in Aramaic, but per se here. It actually may be, then the Chaldeans spoke to the king, open bracket, in Aramaic, close bracket. And the reason I say that is because the language of Daniel, from this point, from Daniel chapter 2, verse 4, until the end of chapter 7, is entirely in Aramaic. So it's not just them speaking in Aramaic. Chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7 are all in Aramaic. Chapter 1, to that point, in chapter 2, is in Hebrew. And then chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10, chapter 11, and chapter 12 are in Hebrew. Which creates an interesting situation. Why is half the book in Aramaic and half the book in Hebrew? Well, here's the short answer. No one really knows. We're not entirely sure. Everything's a guess. So, let me give you some guesses. One aspect that they think, that Daniel was, since we have no original copies of Daniel, that perhaps the entirety of the book of Daniel was written in Aramaic. Yet, as time went on, some of it is lost, but they still, in essence, had it, but not recorded. So when the scribe re-recorded it, he re-recorded the damaged sections in Hebrew and just wrote it in. That's one answer, that it was originally in Aramaic and they wrote in Hebrew. The second one is the opposite. It was all originally written in Hebrew, and Aramaic was, as Aramaic became dominant, Aramaic is used to help correct. There's a third possibility, though. And here's the third possibility. The break in the Aramaic, where it is very peculiar. It's right in the middle of a section. And one of the reasons they think is that in those parts, up till now, who's been, up in chapter 1, up until this point, who's been the focus? Daniel and his friends. The Jews, the Hebrews. So that section is in Hebrew. For the next while, what's the focus? The Gentiles. I'm using that term a little more loosely here, but the Babylonians, the Medes, and the Persians. And so therefore, they think that as the book is spoken to the world at that point, it's written in their tongue of Aramaic. And then when the focus shifts back to what God's going to do with Israel, because that's what's going to happen. You got to remember, even the end times, as it comes back, it's The focus is shifted to the geographical location of Israel, that it now switches back to the language of the Jews, Hebrew. Those are the longer answers. But as I said, everything up to that point, it's really just speculation. This is what happens when we don't have the absolute original documents, and we can't just ask Daniel. Now, which one of those is most prominent and most likely? I'm going to go with the third one. The reason being, it would seem odd that a copyist who is familiar with Aramaic and copying the book would suddenly switch languages. This isn't the Canadian Parliament. If you don't know what I'm referring to, since Canada has two languages, they speak like 3 sentences in English and they go 3 in French, and they're not just saying what they said again in 2 languages. They just keep switching between languages. I don't even know if I don't know if it's just random when they do it, if they're actually told by the speechwriter, switch languages. I'd have to ask one of the speechwriters. But here, it would just seem like an odd thing to do, that, oh, look, I have all this in now, and I can read it, so I'm going to write this section in a different language anyway. More than likely, there's a theological aspect to this, that it is, when the focus is on Daniel and his people, it's written in his language. When the focus is on the Gentiles, the rest of the world, it's written in the common language of the day. And you got to think, Aramaic was still spoken well into the time of Jesus. So you're talking 500 years of Aramaic all throughout there. And Aramaic would be the language that was used in Babylonia, and then it was, because you got to remember, it wasn't until Alexander conquered everything that Greek spread. So, and then Greek became the dominant language. So Greek dominated over Aramaic, in essence, which also throws out or causes a blow to those who want to hold that Daniel was written in the 2nd century, because Aramaic and Hebrew were starting to diminish, and Greek became the dominant language. And that's where you run into the Greek Old Testament called the Septuagint, or the LXX, as it's abbreviated to. And if you're going, how did Septuagint become LXX? LXX is the Roman numeral for 70, and 70 Jewish scholars were responsible for copying the Old Testament from Hebrew Aramaic into Greek in the Septuagint. And keep in mind, the Septuagint was even used by the Apostle Paul in his day, because there's quotes that we know that's like, okay, what's he using? Oh, he's using the Septuagint. Here he uses what they're familiar with. But it's one of those fascinating things that it really looks at when God is dealing with the nations at large. He speaks in their language. When God's speaking to the Israelites, he's using their language. And so we can grasp who he's kind of talking to at that point. So from now until the end of chapter 7, just for a note, this is all in Aramaic kind of thing. Not that that's really going to change anything, but unless you want to read it in Aramaic, that's just kind of the way it is. Now, back to our points. That's a side point, but it's in there. That's fascinating to look at. And never shy away from those things. When you run into that, I want you to understand this. The Bible doesn't put anything in there that's just totally random. When the Bible puts a detail in, there's usually a reason for it and an explanation for it. And some of the details can be kind of funky. What I mean by that is the book of Mark, what's the point of putting in the fact that one of the disciples ran away leaving his clothes behind? Kind of an odd thing to put in. But odds are, the reason that that's such an important detail is because it shows that there was an eyewitness. It's an eyewitness account. That means whoever is writing this witnessed this. And it's a detail that really stuck out. The book of Esther's got things too, that the first chapter, where it suddenly gives details that like the color of the curtains. It's like, okay, that's kind of odd. But why is it there? Well, because the author is familiar with it. They saw it. So it gives eyewitness accounts to it. So there's nothing in the scripture that's just redundant and doesn't have meaning. Some has more important meaning than others. Some is just like a clue to things. And so something like that, where it's like they spoke to the king in Aramaic. Well, that's kind of odd. Does that mean the king didn't speak to them in Aramaic? The king spoke to them in one language and then they turn around and answer them in another? No, more than likely what has happened is this is actually brackets. From now on, it's Aramaic. kind of thing. But here, back to our original point, because this is all about who God is. That's what Daniel really is. Daniel, as I said, is the sovereignty of God in all things. What you have here with this dream, and Nebuchadnezzar has the dream, we're not going to unpack the dream tonight, as I said, is he has given Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and this dream, Nebuchadnezzar knows that it is such important that he can't risk his people giving him false information. Which is also kind of interesting because it kind of indicates that Nebuchadnezzar knows that he's got some men who will tell him what he wants to hear. He's smart enough to understand that he's got some yes men. And that they'll tell him whatever is good, kind of thing. I remember one of the greatest adventures of the Bible, the animated series. It does the second part of this, the writing on the wall. And it has the wise men kind of there, the Chaldeans again there. And they're like, it's like, read this writing. And they're like, I can't read it, what do we do? It's like, well, just tell him what he wants to hear. It's like, it's always worked in the past. And he tries that, but obviously it doesn't work out for them. But Nebuchadnezzar, he's smart enough to know that not all of his advisors are going to give him the right advice. They will tell him what he wants to hear. And he knows that this is so important. Deep down inside, he knows it's so important that this is beyond anything else, that he needs the right answer. And so he says, I'm not telling you the dream. And they even admit here that there's a limit to men. There's a limit to men's wisdom. There's a limit to how much man can suddenly understand and proclaim it. There, verse 10, the Chaldeans answer the king, there is not a man on earth who can tell the king tell the king's matter. He's like, there is not a person alive who can do this, no matter where you go. And I think it's important to understand that there are limits to man, because one of the biggest issues that we have in our culture today is thinking that man can explain everything. That we can explain. I think it was I'm trying to think if it was Dawkins or Nietzsche. Nietzsche's more the philosopher aspect, so I'm going to tend to lead with Dawkins here. Who kind of made the argument here that the more that science can explain, the smaller God gets, kind of thing. In other words, this idea that if we can understand and we can explain all this, and we can do it, then there's no need for God. That's kind of the idea. And that's how people run into. We don't need God. Why? Because we can explain. That's where science has gotten off track. This idea that just because I can explain how something works and something done doesn't mean it didn't have a creator behind it. It didn't have a mind behind it. But here the Chaldeans admit, it's like, nobody can do this. There is a limit to it. You see that even with the Moses in Egypt. There's a reason that it said, and then the magicians did it by their black arts. The magicians did it by their black arts. And then it says, and the magicians couldn't do it. And then what was their explanation? This is the finger of God. What are the Chaldeans saying? We can't do this. There's not a man alive in this. And he comes out and they're like, the only one who can do this, except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. Their dwelling is not with men. Who can understand? Only the gods can even do this. And then what is the very next thing that we see? It goes to Daniel. God is with him. God dwells with his people. And in the end, you get this in that Daniel's reliance is on God. When Daniel gets this, you look at what he says, verse 20. Then Daniel answered, so Daniel blessed the God of heaven. So he's praising him, giving him glory. And he says, blessed be the name of God forever and ever. For wisdom and might are his. He changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. Why do you think he says that? Because he's got the interpretation of the dream. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might. You have now made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's demand. Who's Daniel praising? God. You know, there was somebody else in the Old Testament that took a little longer to learn this lesson. It was Joseph. Joseph got the interpretation of dreams. He got dreams, he got interpretation. The family knew them. What did Joseph do? He was like, look how important I am. He gets to the prison. The baker and the cupbearer, they have dreams. When he forgets about the baker because the baker is going to be dead. The cupbearer, though, is like, when you get out of here, make sure you tell Pharaoh about me. A couple years later, when Pharaoh has the dream, Joseph's now before him. And the king finally, and the Pharaoh goes, it's like, I've heard that you can interpret dreams and you can tell them what they mean, even the deepest. Joseph now has learned, I can't do it. God does it, and he will tell you your dream. Daniel doesn't have to go through all that. Daniel got it from the beginning. Why? Because he probably studied Joseph. He's like, God is the one who answers. God, I'm giving you the praise. And ultimately, who gets the glory? God does. God is sovereign over it all. And in the end, it is his name that'll be praised. Look at how he started. Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever. That's who gets the glory. Daniel relied completely on God. God gave him the wisdom. God gave him the skills. God gave him the ability. And not once did Daniel say, look at me. He said, look at God. Give God the glory. And even when the second time it comes up, and we'll get there with the grandson, Daniel's like, keep your reward, give the praise to God. God's going to tell you it. And here's the meaning of it. It was always given praise to God. Why? Because God is sovereign. God is with his people. And God will do all things for his glory and our good. All right. We'll stop there. I know I'm a couple of minutes over. I didn't want to just stop where I was at, though. I wanted to continue on. But give you a chance now for any questions, insight, discussion, that kind of thing, if you want. If there's any. All right. So, with that, we'll call it an evening. Although God did it first, I'm just going to reiterate what he said. We'll call it evening, but I always want to encourage you a reminder. Come on out to any of our small groups. I encourage you, for those online, that what we're looking at on Sunday morning. If you didn't see this morning's message, I encourage you to go back and watch that. I do apologize that it's in reverse. I'm going to blame that one on Facebook because they removed the filter that allows me to flip it. But if you can catch it over on YouTube, which will be there in probably 2 hours, you can get it right. You get it right side up, I mean. But we're looking at the fact that this month it's for God's glory and for our good. And we're going to be looking at how even when we're suffering and the suffering we have, it'll be used for God's glory and for his good. So I encourage you to partake of that each Sunday morning at 10:30. This week, everything is on, kind of thing. Tuesday night, Kids Club, 6:30. Wednesday night, small group. I don't think you're doing the potluck this week. No one knows. It'll come out. Your leader will get to you and bring that out. So it's either 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock, Aubrey small group. Thursday morning, small group Bible study happens here at the church with Paul, looking at the book of John. Friday night group is happening. Friday night teens coming on out. I just see a prayer request there. Yes, we will pray for your father. And so we will pray for that. When we go off the air, we do have a prayer time. It's one of the benefits you get coming in person. Then, remember, Thursday night, annual meeting, unless the weather doesn't cooperate. And then if it doesn't cooperate, the annual meeting's making a kind of a change. It'll be on the 16th of February, following our Soups on potluck that we have every year in February to kind of get over those winter blues. So it'll be that's when it'll be. So this Thursday, which means deacons, please look forward to making a call. Watch the weather. You can make a call on that kind of thing. And then we'll do what we did last time. We'll get a message out for you, email out, and try to catch those who don't get email kind of thing. If you're unsure, and I'll tell you this, if you're unsure if there's an annual meeting on Thursday, just call one of the leaders and we'll let you know if you hadn't heard kind of thing. But until then, as always, I pray that the Lord would bless you. May you know that you are kept in his care, and may you know that all things are for his glory, as he is sovereign over all, and you can trust him to always do what is good. And so until next time, may you walk with the Lord and grow in him.